Good evening. Welcome to the museum at FIT's Fashion Culture Special Program Series. My name is Tania Melendez, and I am Senior Curator of Education at the museum at FIT. Tonight, I am honored to present Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era. The author of this book is a faculty member of the History Department at the University of New Hampshire. She has held curatorial positions at several New England museums. She was the Andrew Oliver Research Fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and she is currently guest curator of Fashioning the New England Family at the Society. Her book will appear, of the same title, will appear later this year. The book she will present tonight, Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era, traces the history of early Anglo-American footwear from the 1740s through the 1790s. After her lecture, she will sign books on stage. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Alexander.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you, Tania, for all the arrangements. I felt very fortunate to have an invitation from Dr. Steele. It seems like ages ago now to come and talk to you all about shoes. And who doesn't love to talk about shoes? Right? I had to decide I could only bring 2 pairs, so which were they going to be? The old standby faux croc purple, that's what you got actually tonight, or the Suzanne slingbacks, or my latest favorite of Lucy Choi. That's my extravagance. But at any rate, thank you all for welcoming me. I think that shoes, in many ways, certainly 18th century shoes, have been one of the neglected and under-recognized clues into our American past. They're often found stashed in cupboards, pushed in the back of drawers, secreted away behind walls and chimney breasts. For many of us, they represent some of history's small mysteries. Yet a shoe can reveal much about the everyday lives of people in the past, whether they were famous or whether they were ordinary. In the drawer that I show you here in this image, you see a number of lovely petite silk shoes made during this long 18th century. But when you look at them closely, you'll find that in many cases they are much more than just that. They may be disarmingly pretty, but they may be able to tell you something about the wearer's health, the wearer's economic condition, and general condition in life. Shoes maintain some element of the wearer long after the wearer has passed along. And I think that's one of the exciting things when I start examining shoes, is looking for the traces that have been left behind. I'd like to start with a bit of a personal anecdote, because I suppose I should be embarrassed to say that I've been working on this project for almost a decade. I might be embarrassed to say that actually, you all are visual people. You'll understand that having one entire computer that has 10,000 images of shoes is not necessarily a case of overkill. And that I've visited at this point over 30 different archives, both in North America and in Great Britain. And yet, if you were to think about what it is about shoes, what attracts me to them, it is more often the stories, as it turns out, I've come to realize, than in fact always the construction. These stories captured by shoes are often our only connection to a person whose life has been largely lost to the historical record, whether an aspiring consumer or an unknown but highly skilled shoemaker or cordwainer who supplies shoes for his rural community. My research into this area began somewhat by chance at a museum in Portsmouth, New Hampshire called Strawberry Bank. And the shoes that I'm showing you here on the screen in front of you were my first opportunity to examine up close a pair of Georgian shoes. Now, when I see them, I see something of beauty. You may look at them and see the shattered silk, the rips, the dirt, but I see this amazing and well-crafted piece. When I first looked at the shoes, I was amazed at all of the energy that had been placed into creating this particular shoe. I wanted to know who wore it, when they wore it, where they wore it, how did it end up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire? And as I started to search for signs of the original owner, I found in the footbed of the shoe a label. And I'd like just to mention that the photographs that you're seeing here in front of you were taken by New York photographer Ellen McDermott, who did a masterful job of catching both the beauty and the nuances of this pair of shoes from about 1740. These are brocaded silk with a covered heel, which is carved of wood, known in those days as a French heel, today known as a Lewis heel. And in the view looking down, you'll see what's known as a paten, or an overshoe. You can see how they went together to keep a woman's footwear just slightly elevated out of the muck and grime. But these were not shoes you were going to be wearing for blocks and blocks in an unpaved New York in the 18th century. When I started exploring, this is what I found inside the shoe. This small circular label that said Thomas Rideout and James Davis, shoemakers near Aldgate, London. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And what that did was start me on a series of asking questions. Another collection, this is historic Deerfield in Deerfield, Massachusetts, which also has a large collection of shoes by British shoemakers that have survived into the American colonies. And I just always need to include this. This is actually a German colored engraving from the mid-18th century called The Shoe Seller's Wife. And she's holding this tray out to you with what can only be described as a bonbon of assortments of mules and pumps and children's shoes and men's shoes and even a pair of boots. And she's got this incredible sort of outfit on in this sense of almost itinerant shoe seller. This is the image I began with from the Warner House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And I was talking to some participants before the talk, and if you were to go and open this very drawer in the Warner House, the shoes would look pretty much like this. Not quite as neat, because, the photographer did a few adjustments, of course. But to be able to open a drawer in an antique chest and see it full of shoes, for me, represented an incalculable amount of information to sort through. And if you take a look at the far single shoe in this corner, you'll notice it has a label in it. I have a funny story to tell you. Very frequently in collections, you end up with one shoe, not a pair. And early on in my work, I was giving a tour, and I was talking about these single shoes, and someone raised their hand, and they said, I had no idea there were so many one-legged women in the American colonies. To what do you attribute that? And after I recovered from the question, and I thought about it a little bit, I started thinking, well, why is that? Well, it's very easy to give one child one wedding shoe and another child another wedding shoe, or the shoes that you wore at a ball with Lafayette, perhaps, or dancing with George Washington. Shoes were easy to divide. It's not quite as easy to divide up an entire 18th century gown, is it? So the shoes are divided. Very rarely do they come back together. So if anyone asks you that question, that is why you find so many single shoes in museum collections. Looking at some of the prominent London cordwainers whose shoes were exceedingly popular in the colonies, one might wonder then, how do we know about these makers? Well, as I mentioned earlier, starting in the mid-1800s, many began affixing paper labels to the footbed of their shoes. which allowed me in my research to start to group the shoes by maker. This form would be very familiar to us today as creating a brand identity. London's top cordwainers illustrated not only a pride in their craft, but also a growing interest in trade specialization and advertising, so that you start to see a division between men's and women's shoemakers, shoe and boot makers, and so on, all from this small label. The prevalence of shoes in North American collections that carry the labels of, for example, John Hose and Son, Rideout and Davis, W. Chamberlain and Sons, underscores their importance as coveted commodities in American markets. And we have examples of just about every one of those London shoemakers in this drawer. Here, because I just can't help it, this is some high-quality foot candy. This is a box of shoes from Colonial Williamsburg, and you'll see the silk brocades and silk damasks, the metallic threads, just waiting again for stories to be uncovered. Yeah, right. That's my closet. No, it's not. These are the shoes housed just temptingly at the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto. And if you ever have a chance to go on one of their studio or behind-the-scenes tours, I strongly recommend it. The collection there is just phenomenal. So the survival of these labeled shoes in North American collections helps establish a shoe's provenance and enables us to recreate these shoe stories. And then there are many more modest collections. This is the Dedham Historical Society in Dedham, Mass. Again, lines of shoes with a number of hidden gems, a few wedding shoes and regionally made shoes. And just to sort of think about futures of shoes, here Manolo Blahnik's shoes at the Metropolitan. They were recently also on view at the Bata Shoe Museum for Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette. Talk about shoe bonbons, right? During the 18th century, Baroque, then Rococo, European art, architecture, and fashion introduced this taste for the dramatic. It was a dramatic theatrical movement and the interplay of light and shadow. As global trade expanded in the 18th century, new materials and ideas from foreign ports became less expensive and more accessible. Designers and artisans experimented with bold palettes, active patterns, undulating lines, and S-curves. The naturalistic motifs found in the rich brocades and silks were not limited to interior furnishings and textiles, but permeated all aspects of elite dress. In keeping with the visual lexicon of the era, the goal was to create this sense of movement and dramatic play. A silk brocaded gown with metallic threads or a silk with metallic lace would have displayed a shine and luster, two of the key qualities that were sought after during the Georgian era. It is not surprised to find numerous examples of 18th century wedding dresses in whole or in part, both men's and women's wedding trousseaux, in shoes, stockings, waistcoats, petticoats, aprons, caps, in museums and related institutions. The notion of saving one's wedding attire, of course, is not particularly unusual to us today, although with Marie Kondo telling us all we need to tidy up, I don't know where some of this is going to head, but if you are a collector, I'd be willing to make a safe bet and say that within the next sort of 3 to 5 years, you can start making a killing on some of these textiles. This is a time when a young woman of privilege would receive an education that had as much to do with drawing room skills, such as dance and music, foreign languages, accomplishments in needlework were considered paramount. Needlework and elite young women. Well, they were often a testimony to a young woman's ability and her family's wealth. As a reflection on learning, young women in the colonies created samplers, small domestic items, linens, whitework, lace, which have survived and are among the many and varied examples preserved in collections. For example, the importance of displaying one's skill in embroidery appears in this stunning pre-1750s example. This is a recently conserved petticoat at the Bostonian Society in downtown Boston, and it was conserved about 2 years ago and put on view. This petticoat was the petticoat to go with an open robe or perhaps a sack-back gown that was to be worn, or that was worn by Elizabeth Bull when she married Reverend Roger Price in Boston. What's interesting about it, however, is she started it in 1731 when she was 15 years old. She was still working on it the day she got married. You can still see places where she's drawn in the pattern. This petticoat is currently on view at an exhibit that I guess curated at the Massachusetts Historical Society. You can see where she's hand-drawn the pattern and hasn't yet had a chance to finish it. I figure she's probably cursing me and saying, "Kimberly, how dare you show my unfinished petticoat to the world," because she was nothing if not an incredibly detailed needleworker. So she started this when she was a teenager, and it's a striking example of a garment that is rare for a number of reasons. We know who wore it. We know who embroidered it. We know where she wore it. We know when she wore it. We even know what steps she walked in King's Chapel to get married. And because I am a true history nerd, I went back through as much climate material as I could find, and I can tell you that she was married on a cool, damp day in April. So this makes it a particularly notable survival because it has all of these things going for it. She was the only daughter from a wealthy Boston merchant named John Bull, who had a wharf which still survives with his name on it in Boston to this day. And she received every opportunity for a young, privileged woman living on the periphery of the British Empire. Despite multiple alterations to the dress by family members in the later 18th century, the 1830s, and then again in the 19th century, much of her original embroidery survives. And I'm showing you here a detail. Isn't that just lovely? Again, think of this being finished in 1735. Her hand and the choice of colors are particularly noteworthy in the petticoat. It's an embroidered, really, it's like a silk flower garden, isn't it? Blooming with roses, chrysanthemums, and tulips, and would certainly have been right in the fashionable Rococo style with a healthy understanding of Asian influence at the time. The silk itself was originally a celadon green from China, and it has since faded to cream. Miss Bull would have received instruction either from a dame school, a young woman's seminary, or perhaps because of her wealth, maybe someone came to the house. But like genteel young ladies of this sort, she was expected to develop skills in deportment in addition to her needlework skills. For birthdays and other special occasions, relatives and family and friends may have presented her with popular books of the day for young readers. She may well have studied The School of Good Manners by Boston schoolmaster Elizur Moody, who was the first British-American writer on manners. Moody's Guide to Gentility first appeared in Boston in 1715, just a few years before Elizabeth was born, and it included such pearls of wisdom, and I quote, "Gnaw not bones at the table, but clean them with a knife." Books like these filled the bookshelves of the quality in Virginia and Massachusetts. These courtesy books were about imitation, that it was the key to learning how to fit in to society and to engage with company. As I mentioned, when she started the dress, she had not yet met and was certainly not betrothed to Reverend Roger Price, who was the head of the Anglican Church in Boston. She actually departed. I'm just going to say this as an aside. Elizabeth had extreme wealth. Her husband had status. I don't know, they had several children. By our standards, I don't know that it was a particularly joyous marriage. While we have no letters from Elizabeth, save a few minor notes in her ladies' memorandum books, such as this one, he seemed to be a real crank. He's always complaining to the bishopric about he doesn't have enough money, his quarters are inadequate, and so on. And so we actually, and even in a time well before the American Revolution, he writes about those detestable colonials on more than one occasion. So when she departs with Reverend Price and her children for England, she's going there as someone who's never been there before, and she actually never returns. However, Elizabeth has left us with a mystery. Her shoes were recorded as part of the original gift to the Bostonian Society in 1910, but they've never been found, leaving us only with the tantalizing tidbit that in the collection were her high-heeled wedding shoes. Now, if I were to envision what those shoes might have looked like, I can think of no better example than a pair here at the museum at MFIT, which date to about 1740. So just a few years later, you can note the hand embroidery. It's also a terrific example of a shoe on the left showing the ravages of time and the incredibly painstaking and careful conservation and restoration of the shoe on the opposite side. I think that if she were to have made her shoes, she may well have opted for something along these lines, although because she was so incredibly fashionable, I imagine she may have worn French backless mules rather than pumps. If you take a look at the detail, look at the way the carnation has been placed right there on the perfect tip of the toe. Again, somebody's taking great pains in the embroidery of these uppers of their shoes. These shoes are also a perfect segue to the next pair of shoes I'd like to mention to you, which are the wedding shoes of Hannah Edwards Wetmore from 1742. It seems quite likely that, again, much like Elizabeth Bull, and maybe for those of you who are stitchers, maybe this makes sense. It's really hard to finish things. I know that as an academic. I mean, I could have kept on working on this book probably for the rest of my life. But there's evidence, if you take a look at the embroidery at the toe and on the main sort of cartouche on the front, you'll see that there are two different hands working on these shoes. I have a feeling that Molly, Hannah's sister, stepped in to help her finish the embroidery before the wedding. The hands are really that much different. In 18th century America, as now, weddings were a time, of course, to celebrate. And the household would try to afford the latest, preferably this might be the latest fashion from London. But if your budget did not permit this, the couple then would wear their best suit of clothes, repaired or refurbished, perhaps a gown handed down from a grandmother to a mother, or a pair of shoe buckles from a favorite aunt. For instance, in the 1742 novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, the father of the bride does not have the appropriate footwear to wear for the occasion. And the bride's soon-to-be husband, the groom, was then, and this is a quote, was then pleased to give him the silver buckles out of his own shoes. So this importance of these rituals, of these moments. Dressing for the future revealed this idea, the sense of being prepared for, presenting yourself for self-fashioning and preparing for the future. Although, and this is another piece of needlepoint embroidery, although we're not sure which one of the Edwards sisters created it. Although historians see the 1740s as the beginning of a consumer revolution in early America, what we see here with the shoes is a different approach. Once complete, the handmade embroidered uppers would have been taken to a local shoemaker, a cordwainer. And the phrase that I find in my research, because this happens often that women would bring in their shoe uppers, was, and I quote, "the upper attached to my sole leather," which is what would have happened here. So here, rather than importing shoes, having bespoke shoes made in Great Britain, which clearly someone as wealthy as the Edwards could have done, she decided to make this different choice and selected her own handmade embroidered footwear, making a significant statement about her values as well as those of her family. What were some of the other shoes that were being worn by the elite at this time? This is another pair of London-made silk brocade shoes. Again, these are by Rideout and Davis. These are in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. They are absolutely pristine. If you think of sort of a corollary in terms of haute couture, high style, these would be your Jimmy Choos or Manolo Blahniks of the day. And these were expensive shoes. They could cost anywhere from $2 to a week of a working man's wage. And that was just for the shoe. Now, you didn't need to buy shoe buckles all the time, but in a pair like this, and you can see the long latchets or straps. This is obviously pre-Velcro, pre-snaps, pre-buttons. So you attached your shoes with shoe buckles. So not only are you going to be investing in the shoes, you also have shoe buckles, which can be very simple, or they could be paste buckles with paste stones, or they could even have semi-precious stones. These shoes, I'm still trying to fully unlock the story, but they were found in an attic in Eliot, Maine, pushed back in the back of an attic crawl space, and I've examined them. I don't think they were ever worn. I'm trying to figure out who owned the house, how they might have come to be there. But at any rate, they're now in the collection. And again, that label. Another pair of very popular shoes, in fact, probably the shoemaker who was in many ways responsible for angering the Patriots in the years leading up to the Revolution, was John Hose, an unassuming British cordwainer with a limp, who was in his 40s and 50s, who exported not hundreds but thousands of his shoes to the American colonies and the West Indies. This is an example of his finest pair of shoes, the quality of the finest pairs of his shoes. These are in the collection of Historic New England. These date from about 1760s. And for those of you who spend a lot of time sewing, you'll notice, if you take a look at the toe, that not only are these shoes costly because of the brocaded silk, but they're pattern matched perfectly. Now, this is a time when shoes were straight-lasted, so there was no difference between right and left. So you'll find that middling women or working women would switch their shoes to get longer wear out of them. If you have toes that are pattern matched and heels that are pattern matched, you can't do that. So it is sort of lost on us today, but if you saw someone walk into the room with pattern matched shoes, you knew right away that these were going to be incredibly costly, because it also involved waste of the textile in order to make the pattern work. And again, John Hose's shoes. As I mentioned, you need a number of different types of materials to stay up to date and in fashion. These are about 1750 paste buckles set in silver. These are actually an example of men's buckles. Here, this is a piece of absolutely dazzling mid-18th century gold lace, metallic lace, basically linen threads, sometimes cotton threads, but at this time linen were then wrapped with actual gold. There was an entire division of artisanry devoted to making gold lace, and it was like the little pop that you would like to have on your garment, on your shoes, on your waistcoat, on your gown. Keeping up with the style of the latest textiles, whether it was a silk damask, a silk brocade, whether it was had chenille woven into it, or metallic threads, or even paste stones and sequins. One of the most desirable materials, of course, was Spitalfields Silk from London. Spitalfields Silk was really for many British Americans, was the go-to silk. This is a detail from a wedding dress from 1747 that has a matching pair of shoes. And what's really exciting is the designs for this particular pattern survive at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so we know that this was actually drawn by one of the few, if not the only, woman silk designer, Anna Maria Garthwaite. Very exciting. So these were the other parts that you had to invest in. This is just to clothe your lower leg. So you've got your clocked stockings, your shoe buckles, your shoes. This is a photograph from the Bata Shoe Museum. It does not show the garters that you would have needed to keep your stockings or hose up. And there are some wonderful collections of garters, but and some of them quite naughty, I might add. What did it all look like when it came together? Beautiful. So the red leather shoes are by James Davis, a London shoemaker. We know, for example, that Martha Washington ordered shoes from Davis of a fine red leather. Those haven't survived, but I think they were probably somewhat like this. But also take a look at that high heel on that shoe. That's probably about a 3.25 inch heel. Those are associated with what were called court shoes, so for court functions. American women tended to prefer a 2 to 2.5 inch heel. This is just from me looking at shoes. I have no one who ever has said that or written it, but that seems to be the case. You find very few heels that were worn by American women that reach this sort of a height. Here, the mules that I mentioned earlier. I like this view, though, because take a close look at her foot. People often look at these silk shoes and they say, oh, people's feet were so tiny. Well, actually, there are a couple of things about that. One is, most of the shoes that are saved, as I mentioned, are usually from maybe a younger period in your life. When you're 16, 17, 18, 21, getting married. You know, I was not averse to wearing a 5-inch heel when I was that age. I would not do it now. Things sort of change. But what are the shoes? If I were to ask you all, how many of you have a pair of shoes in your closet that you love, that you wore, and you'll probably never wore again but can't get rid of? Raise your hand. Right? Okay? So same idea. So these shoes that we see in the museums and so often on display are these beautiful petite shoes. But they also are made of silk and fabric. Look at the way this the foot goes over the mule in the back, right? And she's kind of pushing the front of her foot in there. So, you know, there's a little bit of give. And you find these little secrets the more you start looking at shoes, right? You were able to have a little more stretch than you might imagine. And I've also found, not many, but some pairs of shoes. A pair in New Hampshire, wide shoes. They're probably like a wide plus and a size 10.5. But nobody wants to look at those, right? Except me. Right? So it's sort of like today thinking of saving your running shoes or saving, you know, your pretty shoes or whatever. Unless you won the marathon, and that's something different altogether. I just want to show you a good example of pattern matching here in a gorgeous sack back gown or robe à la française, which has these deep box pleats. Today we call them watteau pleats, and they would cascade down the back of the gown. Look how well pattern matched they are. That's the same sort of thing you're talking about with the shoes. And this also speaks to, again, an excessive amount of wealth. Now, while women appreciated, many women, their London-made shoes, and I should mention that one of the healthiest trades in the British American colonies was actually the used clothing trade. So that even those who were middling sorts or working people often had a chance to buy into this cycle of consumption. Secondhand clothing was not taxed at the same rate. And you had a chance to make purchases, or even we find that in particular men would purchase small bits of leather or gold lace and set them aside for a rainy day, like hoarding, because they had a cash value. And even though it wasn't like the auction houses hung a big sign out front that said secondhand clothes in the back room, when you start reading the advertisements, actually you find that. So there's a very large trade in secondhand clothing as well. So while American women liked their London shoes, not everyone, of course, is going to be able to afford them. And there's going to be a large tradition of local shoemakers, cordwainers, up and down the East Coast, who will supply the local populace with what they need, whether it's for farming or work or walking church. Here I show you an image of the shoe shop at Colonial Williamsburg. And this is Nicole working with a last and making a man's shoe. It's a terrific opportunity if you ever have a chance to go visit. But this would have been more typical of the type of shop that you would have found throughout. The other thing that happens, the change in London labels, will be politics. Started in the 1760s and 1770s, as the political situation between the British American colonies and the Crown and Parliament starts to worsen. There's a huge movement about what we would all understand, which is buy local. And so you start to see ads in newspapers, particularly in places like Newport and Boston, which were real hotbeds of patriot activity. And I call your attention to the piece that is enlarged down below. Great virtue may even be exerted by the ladies in taking the snuff of Rhode Island or preferring the well-turned shoes of Hall and others in Newport to those of John Hose of London, only made for lump sale, or as the tradesmen say, for the plantations. So here we have a shoemaker who's being named, John Hose, whose work we saw, in the newspapers as being somebody who is is a destroyer of American virtue. So, and they're saying, buy local, go to Hall down the street. The largest outfit for locally made, regionally made shoes was in Lynn, Massachusetts. Lynn started as a shoemaking center in the 1600s and still is known today for being shoe city in some places. But I call your attention to the advertisement. Women's Calamanco shoes, Lynn made, as neat and much stronger than any imported from England. So you're putting it right out there. Calamanco shoes were a worsted wool shoe that were then calendared. They were put through hot rollers and given a bit of a glaze, which made them somewhat weather resistant. And they were very much preferred in New England. There were many more Calamanco shoes being made and sold and being imported to the colonies than silk shoes, but they have not survived because they were either worn into pieces and remade or because they are very tasty for vermin. And so there are very few of these shoes that survive. So we have, again, this very skewed impression of what we see in terms of what people were actually wearing. This is a wonderful pair from the Metropolitan Museum, these pink Kalamenko shoes from about 1740. Or here, Vernacular Shoes made from Rhode Island. You can see that they're trying to incorporate this little bit of extra pizzazz with the metallic braid up the front, but the proportions, they're really not quite there. But they were probably a woman's good shoes, going to church Sunday shoes for a working woman or middling sort, with their wonderful ticking lining, added warmth. These are also in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. They recently came up at auction at Skinner's, and as I was mentioning again to some folks earlier, the balance between the cost, thank you. The balance between the cost of the silk shoes and now what we start to see with the vernacular shoes is starting to even out, so that it's public record. So I can tell you this pair of shoes cost over $5,000. Here, another pair, again, a homemade or a vernacular shoes. You can see the shoemaker's got the idea, but he's still working on the technique. Take a look at those side seams, right? There's like no covering, the stitching's all over the map. I don't know how long they would have lasted or how well they would have worn, but at any rate. And then this type of shoe, which is really, whoops, did I lose one of my notes? One of my questions, sorry. A shoe that is from a major shoemaking family in northern New Hampshire, the Lane family, who produced thousands of shoes for the seacoast in New Hampshire. This is the only one that survives. It was a leather shoe made for Huldah Lane in about 1757, so an everyday sort of walking shoe. And at the same time, we have Martha Washington buying her wedding shoes from London. So much has been written about this first couple of couples that the bibliography was a bit intimidating for me to sink my teeth into. But once I got started looking through their account books and then had a chance to look at Martha Washington's shoes, I made some very interesting sorts of discoveries. You may, just to refresh your memory, Martha Washington was married first to Daniel Parke Custis. He died in 1757, leaving her with 4 small children, and she married George Washington in January of 1759. And it was considered to be quite the occasion. In fact, we have a letter that was written. The greatest social event that has ever taken place in our colony occurred some 3 months ago, being the wedding of our mutual friend, Mrs. Dandridge's daughter. The wedding was a splendid affair, conducted after the old English style that prevailed among the wealthy planters. Ladies appeared in the costliest brocades, laces, and jewels which the old world could provide. The bride was arrayed in the height of English fashion, her wealth of charms a fit accompaniment to the manly beauty of the bridegroom, who stood 6 feet 3 inches in his shoes. He's the tallest and handsomest man in the Old Dominion. And I'm showing you here her purple silk satin spangled wedding shoes with silver metallic embroidery and pearl work, a white rand pointed toe, 2.5-inch heel, and they survive. This is a later envisioning of the wedding. We know that Martha's shoes were made in London. We do not know who made them. But when she got married, she would have appeared much as she does in this Wollaston portrait from 1757. There's a detail of the toe of the shoe. As you can see, the silver is much tarnished, but can you imagine when that was brand new, how that would have looked? In fact, this shoe has very little like it in any American collections. Every part of it, including the backs of the heels, you can see is encrusted with some sort of ornament. There are very few purples that survive, and I just want to show you this again. This is much faded. The shoes are in the care of Mount Vernon, but long before people really understood how dyes worked, they were left on view for an extraordinarily long period of time and have since faded. But purple was a very expensive and hard to master color. So the fact that she chose purple and that there are so few other examples means that she's really making a statement, doesn't it, on her wedding day. And this is a pair from Colonial Williamsburg, and I think that purple is much closer to what hers would have been originally. I have an anecdote to share with you about her shoes. I was fortunate enough to be able to see them in person, and I was able to look down inside her shoes, and you could see where her toes gripped the footbed. You know, some of us curl our toes when we're nervous, or stretch your toes, or maybe she was just dancing with George a lot. We know he liked to dance, or maybe she was on her tiptoes because he was so tall. But at any rate, I could see the impressions of her feet inside the shoes, and there was something so incredibly amazing about that it was one of those aha moments when I actually had to step back and not only think about what I was seeing, but also how we interact with objects and people from the past. After spending their honeymoon or wedding trip in Williamsburg, the newlyweds soon parted company. Some years later, George Washington remained extremely pleased with his bride when he wrote, "I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time or distance can change." The shoes here are court shoes in the Victoria and Albert Museum. You can see the similarity to Martha's shoes there. And I realize I need to skip a few of our stories. I'd like to conclude with a pair of bride's shoes, someone who you've never heard of and probably will never hear of. And her name was Mary Wise Farley. And she was married about 5 years after Martha Washington. And these shoes are housed at the Ipswich Museum in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Right away from looking at them, you can see that there's something different, can't you? They're a rare surviving example of how one woman addressed her disability and can be found in her pair of shoes. Her shoes reveal that she was lame. Now it appears, as far as I can tell, that she never wrote down her story, but her extant shoes give her a voice if we actually can take the time to listen. Indeed, if it were not for the survival of this pair of shoes, all we would know about Mary Wise Farley is when she was born, when she got married, and when she died. So this pair of shoes really spoke to me about the ability to bring someone out from the shadows and give them a voice even several hundred years later. They were worn on her wedding to Nathaniel Farley. It was her first marriage. She was 21, and it was Nathaniel's second. They had a son named Daniel, and I say thank you, Daniel, for saving those shoes. At first glance, as I said, you can see that they're unusual. One has been built up at the sole, or they've been built up at the sole and heel to accommodate the difference in the length of the bride's legs. The lower shoe has a heel of 1.25 inches, and the other has a heel of 2.75 inches. A special wood and leather platform or superstructure was constructed. And if you take a look at the piece on the front of the higher shoe, the same silk was brought in and meticulously stitched to the front of the shoe to match the silk brocade of the rest of the shoe. We don't know who made them, if they were originally bespoke from London and then adapted in America, but what's important is that she did not intend these silk buckle shoes to be hidden. She was not of the elite like a Martha Washington. She was comfortable, she was of the quality, middling sort, And although it's perhaps difficult to visualize today due to the shattered and shredded silk of the textile, when new, the silk would have caught glints of light as she walked, as would the glittering buckles with which she attached her shoes. In her selection of fashionable footwear for her wedding, this particular bride was able to take agency, even if it was just for that one special day, in a world that frequently offered little to women, regardless of their social, economic, or physical condition. I want to show you the gentleman is suffering from gout. We see all sorts of shoes for different problems: bunions, overpronation, gout, shoes that are extended through gussets for pregnancy. When I start looking at shoes, you can start to see these things. And the gout shoes were usually cork, and on the opposite screen, one of the more common solution, although this is later, this is in the 19th century, to dealing with someone with a disability, was to use these very awkward and unattractive shoes. Whereas, as I say, Mary Wise Farley was making a decision about what she would wear. So at the end of the day, I was thinking about, my book concludes sort of saying that as we approach mechanization in the 19th century, and people have access to more pairs of shoes, they're less expensive to make, the stories start to fade a little bit into the background, or at least that's what I believed. And then I went to an exhibit. It was actually organized by Lisa Small at the Brooklyn Museum here, and I saw it at the Currier Museum in Manchester, New Hampshire, called Killer Heels. And I'm sure many of you have seen it. Yeah. So what they did at the Manchester site was they kept notebooks for visitors to write down their thoughts about shoes. What was their first experience wearing a heel? Or can heels and feminism coexist? And I'm currently doing a sort of informal article about these shoes, and so I started just to show you this. 1984, peach-colored leather with a peep toe, wood stiletto heel, hurt like hell, but looked fabulous. What do you think those shoes probably were? Right? Something like that. So I think I need to rethink this idea that I had. I think that, in fact, my time with shoes is not finished. I just participated in a panel looking at where were shoes and high heels going. We might wonder, are men going to reclaim high heels and start wearing them again? They do already, yes. Yeah. Will people continue to actually, will shoe repair come back? I went in and had a lovely chat with a shoe repair gentleman this evening. Look at the pair in the middle where they cut down the heel to make it more fashionable rather than get rid of the shoe. As we say more and more say no to fast fashion, I think the opportunity for whether it's 3D printed or shoes that are made of post-consumer recyclables are going to be becoming more a part of this. But I think there will always be that sort of yin and yang between where we're headed as we move away from fast fashion, but also to the embrace of the craft tradition. So I'm afraid I'm not done with this story yet. Hopefully I'll get to come back sometime in the future and fill you in on where I've been in my travels since then. Thank you all very much. Okay. What's the most, I was about to go off into my own little world here. What's your most inspiring fact I learned in my research? It actually is a very mundane thing, but it excites me because I'm, a historic nerd. So what really has come very clear to me is just how many records and things there are out there that we haven't seen. Fortunately, my husband was the one who told me I needed to stop researching and finish the book. There are so many other stories waiting to be told. And I think that is both inspiring and also daunting. So the fact that there is so much material, there's still so much to read, whether they're from account books, journals, letters, diaries, I remain always certain that someone's going to find that next batch of papers, those missing Mary Wise Farley documents. Because history obviously is not static, it's always changing. Even things like we can do now with technology to understand how shoes were made, repaired, or the way dye was made to color them continues to open my eyes. Could you tell me about your next project? Well, thank you. I've got two different projects going. One will be a book that will be out later this year, which is looking at, again, fashion garments and textiles that have been preserved in families throughout New England, and it's called Fashioning the New England Family. And again, it takes a look at everything from a swatch of fabric that's 1 inch by 2 inches, that was part of Priscilla Mullins Alden's, one of her dresses from 1650, up to the dress purchased by a school teacher in the 1890s with her first check. The way that clothing has so much to say and has so much relevance. After that, the next project that I'll be working on this summer is researching a small New England town in the early Republic and painting a whole biography of the denizens of this small town based on a daybook, a diary, and probate records. So, how much longer do we have to wait until beautiful, comfortable, low-heeled shoes? I think they're here. There are a number of shoes, and again, I'm not so good on brands, but I've seen a number, now that you can do printing on so many different types of surfaces, I've seen a number of women. I usually actually just stop and say, where'd you get your shoes? Because otherwise, how do we know? But I think there are things out there that are comfortable and colorful or interesting. Durability is another thing, though, and I think, there's some shoes who've experimented with heels that can be different heights depending on what you're doing and things like that. But I think they're out there. You just have to look. Since the mules might be small, their silk stockings, how did they not fall out of their shoes? This is a good question. I'm going to read this out loud. Since the mules might be small, and they wore silk stockings, how did the women not fall out of their shoes? Now, this is a really good question, and I can tell you that because I thought it is important for me to have some sense of how you walked in these shoes. No, I have not ever walked in a pair of historic shoes, but several of my good friends are costumers and reenactors, and so I've had the chance to walk in mules. I actually have a pair of shoes by an outfit called American Duchess, who does a great reproduction Georgian shoe, which is one of my most comfortable pairs of shoes. But the mules are an entirely different kettle of fish. You really have to know how you're walking, how to walk and carry yourself. And I think that's something that we're just not used to, because everything from your undergarments, your stays to support your posture, the balance that you would have had in wearing everything from panniers or baskets and petticoats, and how you would have walked on shoes. This is all part of that grace and deportment that we really don't spend that much time thinking about now. And yeah, I would have been the one who would have fallen down the stairs easily. One thing I can tell you about the way shoes like mules are made is they're often lined with a linen, which is not going to be quite as slippery. But that's about the best I can give you on that. And someone asked, what designers, if any, are keeping this style of shoe alive? Well, There are several UK designers. Sarah Juniper is one who does exquisite work, but it's going to cost you. As I said, the American Duchess now does a whole range of shoes that are in leather and fabrics from to represent the mid 18th century through to the early 20th century. And the heels are great, and but they're made for a modern foot and a modern audience. Burnley and Trowbridge. Who else? There are a number of different makers. You can just Google historic shoes. But again, you want to make sure you're checking into the quality of these things too. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Well, who actually makes square-toe shoes nowadays? There's no,
Oh.
in other words, I see them, but they're flat, so for the front of your foot, it's hard to have any room for the tops of your toes.
Yes, and I don't know. I don't know. Square-toed shoes, you know, there are certain shoes that you just keep, and maybe some of you are like this, you've got this great pair of shoes, and you just keep waiting for them to come back. You know, like I waited for years for the stilettos to go away so we could come back to the wedges and the chunky heels, right? So now I'm happy. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you know, looking at some of the designers, if you look at the Roger Vivier shoes, the Kama shoes with the little heel, and those are the ones that I think you know, you might break your neck on. How did you know? Oh, the petticoat was originally celadon green because when you could see some of the seams. Oh, sorry. The question was, how did we know that the petticoat, Elizabeth Bull's petticoat, was originally a celadon green? And because we were able to see areas where it had been hemmed, where it had been unpicked, and you could see this lovely, lovely green, which also is not a color that works for everybody. So I'm very curious as to how, you know, I would love to know what she actually looked like. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. You had some very nice, what were known as indoor shoes or indoor slippers that could be mules that were very, very low heeled, things like that. Not, you know, again, I was talking to some guests today about shoes. So much of what we see, is what we don't see. You know, only recently we started to uncover these small bags that people thought were reticules, realizing that in fact they were shoe bags. It makes total sense. You know, you're going somewhere. I brought one tonight. Actually, my shoe bag I just bought today from some students who were raising money for a trip. Indigo dyed in the dye studio, and they're perfect for my shoe bag. So some of these things just haven't lasted because they were not considered to be important. A genteel woman at that time period would not have considered her slippers necessarily something that she would maintain, although she may have given them to somebody else in her household. Great. Thank you all very much.